Understanding the Impacts of Generative AI Use on Children. The Alan Turing Institute. Prepared by Yumna Hashim, Saba Esnashari, Kate Onslow, Sukankana Chakraborty, Anton Poltev, John Francis, and Dr. Jonathan Bright. In collaboration with Children's Parliament supported by the LEGO Group. About the team. The AI for Public Services team at the Alan Turing Institute is part of the Public Policy Program. Through a stream of foundational and applied research, we focus on investigating when and where AI can be applied in the public sector in ways that are responsible, responsive, efficient. We collaborate with a range of public sector organizations in the UK too, including the Department for Transport, the Office for National Statistics, and the General Medical Council, to examine the feasibility and impact of AI adoption across various application areas. Our research includes understanding the use and impacts of perceptive, predictive, and generative AI systems in the public sector using surveys. The team recently published a paper on the use of generative AI in the UK's public sector, and a report exploring doctors' understandings and use of AI systems in their clinical practice. Key findings. This report presents the findings from 2 surveys which look to explore the impact of generative AI use on children's learning, development, and overall well-being. With a focus on the UK, the first of these surveys was of 780 children aged 8 to 12 and their parents or carers. The second of these surveys was of 1,001 teachers working in primary or secondary schools with children aged 1 to 16. 1. Most of the households we surveyed are using generative AI tools, though that distribution is concentrated in England and differs based on household income. Our research shows that 55% of households in the UK are using generative AI tools. Within this group, we find significant differences in use based on social grade and region. 61% of parents from social grades A, B, and C1 report that they or others in their household use the technology, whereas 44% from social grades C2, D, and E report the same. We also observe regional differences, with 57% of parents based in England reporting household use of generative AI. These numbers are lower for Wales, 50%, Northern Ireland, 41.2%, and Scotland, 40%. Subsequently, children's awareness around generative AI appeared to be impacted by some of these factors. Of children who reported having heard of the term generative AI, 71% of these live in households that are using the technology. Further, 70% of children who have heard of the term are from social grades A, B, and C1, as opposed to 30% from social grades C2, D, and E. 2. Nearly a quarter of children aged 8 to 12 report having used generative AI, with the most used tool being ChatGPT. 22% of children surveyed reported using a generative AI tool, with the vast majority, 72%, reporting using it once a month or more. Use of the technology is lowest amongst 8-year-olds at 14% and highest amongst 12-year-olds at 26%. Interestingly, while reported use steadily increases with age, we see a slight decline in this increase amongst 11-year-olds, before observing an increase once more with 12-year-olds. We find a slight gender difference, with 24% of female children reporting using generative AI compared to 19% of male children. The most popular tool used amongst children is ChatGPT, with 58% who use generative AI reporting using this tool. This is followed by Gemini at 33% and My AI by Snapchat at 27%. We also find that, amongst children with additional learning needs, the rate of ChatGPT usage is significantly higher than those without additional learning needs, at 78% compared to 53%, respectively. Of those not using generative AI, more than half had not previously heard of the term, with significantly lower levels of awareness among children attending state schools compared to those attending private schools. 3. Children are mainly using generative AI to explore their creativity, find out information or learn about something, and for digital play, though these uses vary within subgroups. Children who use generative AI report using it for a variety of different reasons. 43% of children report using the tools for creating fun pictures and to find out information or learn about something, and 40% report using it for entertainment and playing around. Our findings show interesting variations by age, gender, and additional learning needs. Each age group differs in the most highly reported use of generative AI. 8-year-olds mainly use the technology for entertainment, 9-year-olds mainly use it to find out information or learn about something, 10-year-olds mainly use it for creating fun pictures, 11-year-olds mainly use it for entertainment and finding out information or learning about something, and 12-year-olds mainly use it for help with homework or schoolwork. Children with additional learning needs report using generative AI at significantly higher rates for communication and connection, which includes playing with friends, 30% versus 19% of children without additional learning needs. Getting advice on something personal, 39% versus 16%, and chatting and keeping themselves company, 37% versus 22%. 4. The majority of children who report using generative AI find the technology exciting, with these numbers increasing if their parents or carers hold optimistic views towards the technology. 68% of children who use generative AI report finding it exciting, as opposed to just 22% of those who don't use it. We observe similar numbers with regards to fears around the technology. 63% of children who use generative AI report not finding the technology scary or confusing, as opposed to 23% of those who don't use it. Aside from this clear correlation of generative AI use to levels of excitement and optimism, our findings also seem to indicate a significant correlation between children's attitudes towards the technology and their parents' or carers' attitudes towards the technology. Of the children using generative AI who report the highest levels of excitement, 93% had parents who reported feeling positively about their children's use of the technology. Similarly, of the children who reported the lowest levels of fears around the technology, 87% had parents who felt positive about their children's use of the technology. 5. Children who attend private schools are far more likely to report having used generative AI than children who attend state schools. Similarly, teachers working in private schools report higher student usage of generative AI than state school teachers. 52% of children attending private schools report using generative AI, as opposed to 18% of children in state schools. Children attending private school also report more frequent use of the technology, with 72% of these children reporting using generative AI at least a few times per week, compared to 42% of children who attend state schools. We observe similar trends in teachers' awareness of their students' use of the technology. 57% of private school teachers report awareness around their students' usage of generative AI for schoolwork, compared to 37% of state school teachers. 6. Parents and carers are mostly optimistic about their children's use of generative AI, but many report concerns over their children's access to inappropriate or inaccurate information. The majority, 76%, of parents or carers whose children use generative AI feel positively about their children's use of the technology. Our results show that parents or carers who use the technology themselves report substantially higher rates of positivity around their children's use of the technology compared to parents or carers who don't use the technology, at 84% versus 21%, respectively. Despite these reported levels of optimism amongst those whose children use generative AI, we still find that all parents and carers hold significant concerns around the potential impact that the technology could have on their children's exposure to inappropriate, 82% of all parents, or inaccurate information, 77% of all parents. Interestingly, we find that parents and carers report the lowest levels of concern around their children's use of generative AI for cheating in school, with less than half, 41%, reporting feeling concern over this. 7. Parents, carers, and teachers all report similar levels of concern over the negative impact that generative AI may have on children's critical thinking skills. Although parents, carers, and teachers display different areas of concern around the negative impact generative AI may have on children, our report finds these groups share similar levels of concern over the impact the technology may have on children's critical thinking skills. 76% of parents and carers indicated they were concerned their children may be too trusting of the technology and not think critically about the information it provides. 72% of teachers share a similar concern around the negative impact that the technology might have on their students' critical thinking skills. 8. Teachers report that more than half of students who are using generative AI for schoolwork use the tool to submit AI-generated work as their own. Of the teachers who reported awareness of their students' use of generative AI for schoolwork, 57% reported these students were using the technology to submit AI-generated work as their own. When broken down by private versus state school, we find that 47% of teachers working in private schools report awareness around this type of use by their students, compared to 60% of teachers in state schools. Taken together, however, these findings stand in relative contrast to the concerns that parents and carers have around the negative impact the technology might have on their children, with the lowest reported levels of concern around the use of generative AI for cheating at school. 9. 3 out of 5 teachers are using generative AI in their work, with the highest reported uses in lesson planning and research. 66% of teachers report using generative AI in their work, with ChatGPT being the most cited tool being used. Teachers report using the technology for a wide variety of purposes, ranging from student feedback to designing homework assignments. The highest reported use of generative AI amongst teachers is lesson planning and research, with 75% of all teachers who use the technology indicating that they use it for this purpose. Within the population of teachers using the technology, we find differences between use amongst different positions. For example, the majority of special education needs, SEN, teachers, 51%, report using the technology to develop personalized plans for students, whereas only 22% of secondary school teachers report the same. 10. Nearly 2/3 of teachers who use generative AI are accessing these tools through a personal license. 71% of teachers who report using generative AI for work report that they access the technology through their own personal license, with only 26% reporting that their schools provide institutional access. Despite these high levels of independent adoption, the majority of these teachers, 64%, report that their schools are aware of their use of the technology for work. 11. The majority of teachers who use generative AI are optimistic about its use in their work, reporting high levels of confidence and trust in the technology. These teachers also report improvements in their performance on various teaching tasks through the use of generative AI. 85% of teachers that report using generative AI at work agreed that the technology had increased their productivity, with a further 88% agreeing that they felt confident using the tools they listed. More than half of teachers, 61%, also reported trust in the systems they use, and 82% agreed that they felt the technology had a positive impact on their teaching. When asked to assess whether or not the technology had significantly improved the quality of their performance on the activities and tasks they indicated they had used generative AI for, over 75% of teachers agreed that it had. 12. Over 80% of teachers believe that generative AI will support them in their work rather than replace them. These activities ranged from assessing student performance to delivering lessons to students. Across all presented activities, over 80% of the teachers who responded indicated they believed the technology would support them in executing the activity rather than replace them altogether. No activity was marked by teachers as having the potential to be replaced by a generative AI application. 13. Teachers are less optimistic about the impact that students' use of generative AI may have, with the exception of its use as a tool to support students with additional learning needs. Our survey shows that teachers have mixed feelings around the potential impact of generative AI on students' schoolwork and well-being. 64% of all teachers believe that generative AI is a great tool to support students with additional learnings. However, 49% of teachers who are aware of their students' use of the technology for schoolwork indicated they believe the technology has had a negative impact on their students' engagement in classwork, and 48% believe it has made the ideas that students are submitting less diverse. 40% of teachers agreed that generative AI may have a positive impact on the creativity of students' work, with the remaining 60% either disagreeing or feeling neutral. Overall, nearly half, 49%, of all teachers report concern around the impact that generative AI may have on students' well-being, as well as concern around the technology's impact on students' critical thinking skills. When it comes to generative AI's impact on student creativity, our survey found mixed results. Of teachers who reported awareness around their students' use of generative AI, 40% agreed with the statement that the technology has had a positive impact on the creativity of these students' work, as opposed to 43% who disagreed. A separate statement, presented to all teachers, sought to elicit their views on the technology's ability to foster creativity. Here, we find that 45% of all teachers agreed with the statement, as opposed to 23% who disagreed. These mixed results indicate that teachers hold opposing views around the technology, expressing hope and simultaneous concern around the technology's impact on student creativity. Based on these findings, combined with those from WP1 of this research project, we make a range of recommendations for policymakers and industry, which are set out in our recommendations document. Project recommendations can be found here. Introduction. Recent advances in generative artificial intelligence, AI, are transforming how children interact with technology, particularly in education and creative domains. A growing body of research has explored the impacts of generative AI on users, highlighting both its potential benefits and associated risks. Much of the existing literature has focused on adults and teens, leaving significant gaps in our understanding of how younger children, aged 8 to 12, engage with and are affected by these technologies. For example, little is known about how generative AI impacts younger children's learning and emotional development. While some studies have explored how younger children perceive AI, there is limited research on the impact of generative AI on different dimensions of their well-being. This gap is critical as children have distinct developmental needs and rights, such as those outlined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. As generative AI is increasingly embedded in the platforms and tools children use, it is essential to consider their unique needs when designing, developing, and deploying these technologies. Our research addresses these gaps by conducting foundational survey research investigating the impacts of generative AI on children's well-being, with a specific focus on learning through play and creativity. We conducted 2 surveys, one of children aged 8 to 12 and their parents or carers, and the other of teachers working in primary or secondary schools across the UK. Together, these 2 surveys allowed us to develop a more holistic view of children's generative AI use, both within and outside of the classroom, and how this use impacts children's well-being. Each of these surveys therefore aims to explore varying dimensions of generative AI use amongst children. The teacher's survey aimed to explore teachers' thoughts, opinions, and concerns surrounding generative AI in the classroom. The children's survey provided a space for children to self-report on their experiences with the technology and their understandings of it. It also provided an opportunity for parents or carers to express their opinions and perceptions. Surveying both parents or carers and teachers provides critical insights into children's exposure to and use of the technology, as they are responsible for children's learning and development, both inside and outside of the classroom. While studies have found that awareness of AI among children and parents is high, understanding of its functions and limitations is low. By building on this evidence base, we aim to produce a nuanced understanding of how generative AI influences children's agency and well-being, aligning with the UNICEF principles of responsible innovation in technology for children, RITEC. In this report, we present findings from our surveys, contextualized within existing literature, to offer insights into the degree to which children are exposed to generative AI in their daily lives, and the impact this has on various dimensions of their well-being. Methodology. The Children and Parents/Carers Survey was conducted by YouGov plc UK on behalf of the Alan Turing Institute, ATI. The survey questions were designed by the research team at the ATI, with feedback provided by project partners from the LEGO Group, as well as the research team at YouGov. The teacher survey was designed and conducted by the research team at the ATI using the crowdsourcing platform Prolific, which enables access to large participant pools globally. Below, we provide a brief overview of the methodologies used for each of these surveys. For a full demographic breakdown for both surveys, please refer to the appendix. The full surveys, as well as their associated data and the code used to analyze them, can be found here. Children and Parents/Carers Survey. The overall sample size for this survey was 780 children aged 8 to 12, and their parents or carers. YouGov carried out the sampling for this survey, drawing on a panel of 2.5 million plus individuals across the UK who have opted into taking part in surveys with the platform. Nationally representative quotas, adults aged 18 plus, living in the UK, were set for the survey, and the fieldwork was undertaken between 12-25th November 2024. Following the completion of the survey, the figures were weighted to ensure they are representative of all UK children aged 8 to 12, by age and gender. This survey was broken up into 2 sections. The first of these was aimed at parents or carers, and the second of these was aimed at their child. If a parent or carer had more than one child within the 8 to 12 age range, They were asked to allow their youngest child to take the survey. Parents or carers were asked to ensure their child understood the aims of the survey, and consent was required from both the parent or carer and the child, separately. In the first section, we asked parents a few demographic questions, followed by background questions around their child's education and use of technology. They were then asked questions around their personal use of generative AI and questions around their awareness of their children's use of the technology. We then asked parents to hand the survey over to their child to fill out the second section. In the second section of the survey, children were asked questions around their awareness and understanding of different generative AI applications, as well as their use of these systems. Both sections were made up of a mix of open text and multiple choice questions. Teachers' survey. The overall sample size for this survey was 1,001 teachers working with young students, ranging from 1 to 16 years old, based at schools in the UK. The participant pool for this survey was sourced from Prolific, using participant screeners. To take part in the survey, participants had to be located in the UK and had to be registered on Prolific as working as a teacher. The survey itself had additional screeners which asked participants to confirm that they were working as a teacher in a primary or secondary school in the UK. We placed a quota on our sample, 76% female, 24% male, to reflect the gender makeup of the England's teaching workforce, based on the school workforce census provided by the UK's Department for Education. However, given the size and demographic composition of the participant pool available to us on Prolific at the time of survey launch, we were unable to account for any other key demographic features of the teaching workforce. As such, the sample is not a fully representative sample. The survey was made up a mix of multiple choice and open-ended questions. Teachers were asked questions around their use of generative AI and their awareness of students' use of the technology. The questions explored their experiences with the technology, as well as their overall attitudes towards its use by both teachers and students in the classroom. Part 1. Children, Carers, and Parents Survey. Household use of digital technologies and AI. In this section, we give a brief overview of household use of generative AI. We provide a breakdown of key demographic features where we see statistical differences in results and, in later sections of this report, explore how these determinants appear to impact whether a child is likely to engage with or understand generative AI. In our survey, we asked parents and carers about the use of generative AI in their household. We asked these respondents to indicate whether A, they had used generative AI, or B, they hadn't but someone else in their household had. Taken together, these two categories indicate what we refer to as household use of generative AI. Of all respondents, 55% reported household use of generative AI. Amongst these categories, we observed significant differences in the use of generative AI across social grade of the parents or carers, type of education of the child, private or state school, and region. Our findings showed that, while 52% of parents or carers from social grades A, B, and C1 report having used generative AI themselves, only 27% of parents from social grades C2, D, and E report the same. The differences between the social grades are lower when looking at household use of generative AI. 61% of respondents from the ABC1 social grades indicated household use of generative AI, while 44% of parents from the C2D social grades indicated the same. We found stark differences in overall household use of generative AI when comparing groups of parents and carers based on the type of education their child receives. 89% of respondents whose children go to private school indicated overall household use of generative AI, whereas only half, 51%, of the respondents whose children attend state school indicated the same. We also observed differences when comparing use of generative AI across regions. More specifically, we found that 57% of respondents living in England indicated household use of generative AI, with the percentage being as high as 74% for those living in London. We found this percentage to be lower in other regions of the UK, with 50% in Wales, 41% in Northern Ireland, and 40% in Scotland. Children's general awareness of AI. In this section, we briefly present findings that showcase children's general awareness and understandings of AI. We explore the differences in awareness and understanding based on children's age, the type of school they attend, and whether an adult in their life has spoken to them about AI before. To begin, Our survey asked children to use free text responses to describe what comes to mind when they think of AI. Our findings showed that the top 5 most frequently occurring keywords to describe AI were robots, computers, ChatGPT or chatbots, virtual assistant, and intelligent agent. Interestingly, the 6th most frequently used word to describe AI was fake. Next, children were asked whether any adult in their lives had explained AI and its workings to them. Altogether, 37% of children indicated that an adult had spoken to them about the technology. Interestingly, here we found that children from the ABC-1 social grades were more likely to have reported that an adult spoke to them about AI, compared to those from the C2DE social grade, 42% versus 28%, respectively. When asked whether they had specifically heard of the term generative AI before, the majority, 55%, of all children in the study answered no, 30% answered yes, and the rest indicated that they were unsure. Of those who indicated that they had heard of generative AI, 73% were able to pick the correct definition of the technology from the options that were presented to them. We found that, among the children who correctly defined generative AI, 73% had also reported that an adult had spoken to them about AI. In addition, 68% of children who reported having heard of generative AI also reported that an adult had spoken to them about the technology, highlighting the role that parents, carers, teachers, and other adult figures can play in enabling children's awareness and understanding of the technology. Our results also showed that children's awareness around generative AI appeared to be correlated with household usage of the technology. Of children who reported having heard of the term generative AI, 71% of these lived in households that report using the technology. Turning to the different age groups, we found that, unsurprisingly, older children were more likely to have heard about generative AI, with only 15% of 8-year-olds reporting awareness as opposed to 47% of 12-year-olds. These findings were broadly echoed in Work Package 2 of this project, where in-person workshops with children aged 9 to 11 were held, looking to explore their views on and experiences with generative AI. During these workshops, older children expressed greater familiarity with generative AI tools. Further, our survey results showed that gender did not appear to impact awareness. Male and female children reported similar levels of awareness around generative AI. Interestingly, we did observe some regional differences. Children living in London reported higher awareness compared to children from other regions across the UK. Difference in awareness was most prominent across type of education and social grade. 71% of private school students reported an adult having spoken to them about what AI is, and 59% reported having heard of it, while this was only at 33% and 27% for state school children. Awareness around students' use of generative AI. In our survey, we asked teachers to indicate whether they were aware of their students making use of generative AI for schoolwork. If they did, teachers were then asked a set of follow-up questions related to their students' use and the perceived impact teachers felt it has had on their work and well-being. Alongside these questions, a set of statements related to students' use of generative AI was shown to all teachers in our sample, regardless of whether they were aware of their students using generative AI or not. Our findings showed that, whilst teachers are largely optimistic about their own use of generative AI, they do not generally share the same enthusiasm for children's use of the technology in school. Altogether, 40% of teachers reported that they were aware of their students using generative AI for schoolwork. These numbers were higher in private schools, where 57% of private school teachers reported awareness of students' use as opposed to 37% of state school teachers. These numbers broadly align with our children and parents/carers survey, where we found that 52% of private school students were making use of generative AI. Of the age groups teachers taught, we observed the highest rates of reported usage amongst older students, with 70% of teachers teaching 14 to 16-year-olds reporting awareness of usage, compared to 21% of teachers teaching 7 to 11-year-olds. Whilst this survey has a wider student age group than our children and parents/carers survey, we are still able to observe similar age-related usage trends across both surveys. Art and design, design and technology, and music teachers reported the lowest awareness of students' generative AI usage, at 18%, 17%, and 16% respectively. English teachers, on the other hand, reported the highest rates of awareness at 28%, followed by science at 26% and ancient and modern foreign languages at 25%. When asked what their students were using generative AI for, The majority of teachers indicated their students were using it for either research at home, 68%, or developing ideas to help them get started on an assignment, 51%. Importantly, more than half of teachers, 57%, indicated that their students were using generative AI for writing and submitting AI-generated work as their own. Interestingly, there were some differences between use cases of students in private versus state schools as reported by teachers. Nearly 60% of teachers in state schools reported students write and submit AI-generated work as their own, while this was at 47% for private schools. In addition, 43% of teachers in private schools reported that students use generative AI for research during class time versus just 23% of teachers in state schools. Teachers were also asked whether they assign work to students which asks them to use generative AI, of which only 18% reported that they do. These findings are significant, as they raise important questions around plagiarism and academic misconduct. This is especially true when considered alongside previous findings where teachers report high levels of confidence in their ability to identify AI-generated content, as well as the general lack of clear guidance or policy on generative AI use for students. Views around students' use of generative AI. We also explored different dimensions of impact that generative AI use may have on students' work. Teachers who reported awareness around their students' use of generative AI were asked whether they believed the technology had impacted the type of work their students are producing for school or their engagement in the classroom. 61% believed it had. These teachers were then shown a set of 3 statements related to generative AI's impact on key dimensions related to students' creativity, engagement, and diversity of ideas, and asked to rank each of these 3 statements on a scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree or don't know. 49% indicated they believe the technology has had a negative impact on the students' engagement in classwork, and 48% believe that AI has made the ideas students are submitting less diverse. A further 43% disagreed that generative AI has had a positive impact on the creativity of students' work. These findings paint a picture of lack of general optimism around the positive impacts that generative AI could have on children's learning and development in school. Teachers who use generative AI in their own work were more likely to agree that generative AI has had a positive impact on the creativity of students, as opposed to teachers who do not use the technology, 45% versus 17%, respectively. They also were less likely to agree that generative AI has had a negative impact on students' engagement, 44% versus 62% of non-generative AI users. We also observed key differences in how private school teachers viewed the impact of the technology as opposed to state school teachers. Private school teachers were less likely to agree that generative AI has made the ideas students are submitting less diverse, 36% versus 50% of state school teachers. Finally, we explored teachers' general views on students' engagement with generative AI. We presented all teachers in our sample with 5 statements related to students' engagement with the technology and asked them to rank each on a scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree or don't know. We find that 64% of all teachers agreed that generative AI is a great tool to support students with additional learning needs. In the workshops undertaken in Work Package 2, children themselves suggested they would like to see generative AI tools being used to support those with additional learning needs. 72% of all teachers reported concern around the negative impact generative AI may have on students' critical thinking skills, a number which closely aligns with concerns raised in the Children and Parents/Carers survey, where 76% of parents or carers expressed similar concerns. Overall, nearly half of all teachers, 49%, are concerned about the impact that generative AI may have on children's well-being. A further 44% of teachers indicated they are worried that generative AI might limit the level of engagement that teachers have with students. Teachers who reported using generative AI were more optimistic on students' engagement with it. They were less likely to report they are worried that generative AI will negatively impact students' critical thinking skills, 65% versus 81% for non-AI users, that it will limit the level of engagement teachers have with students, 34% versus 61% for non-AI users, and that it negatively impacts students' well-being, 40% versus 62%. They were also more likely to agree that generative AI can help foster students' creativity, 50% versus 29% for non-AI users, and that it is a great tool to support students with additional needs, 70% versus 39%. In addition, male teachers were more likely to agree that generative can help foster students' creativity compared to female teachers, 54% versus 40%. Hopes and concerns around children's use of generative AI. This final section explores the key themes that emerged from two open-ended questions that were asked of teachers. Rather than being prescriptive, the open-ended nature of these questions allowed teachers to reflect, in a speculative way, on their hopes and concerns around children's use of generative AI. The first of these questions, what is your greatest hope for how AI can benefit children? Aim to capture the areas where teachers may feel optimistic about the technology, with the intention of identifying either unexplored opportunity areas or allowing for further exploration of areas of use which have already been identified as having a positive impact on children's well-being. The second of these questions, what is your biggest concern about children using AI, allowed for the opposite. An exploration of fears, whether observed or hypothetical, around the technology. Around 1/3 of teachers responded that they are hopeful about AI's ability to enhance students' creativity. 1/3 mentioned AI's ability to support independent learning, and 1 in 5 mentioned AI's ability to provide students with easier access to information. On the other hand, two main themes emerged around concerns: over-reliance on AI, referenced by more than half of teachers, and loss of critical thinking, referenced by nearly half of teachers. These concerns are consistent with findings highlighted elsewhere in this report, and have also been highlighted in the literature as possible drawbacks to generative AI use among students. Nearly 1 in 4 teachers reported that they believe the use of AI by students and their subsequent reliance on these systems might reduce engagement in the classroom. Nearly 1 in 5 reported that AI might lead to stifled imagination and loss of creativity in students, an insight which is consistent with the findings echoed elsewhere in this survey. Further, around 1 in 6 teachers mentioned concerns about plagiarism and academic integrity in schoolwork, and the same ratio mentioned concerns around students' exposure to inaccurate information through AI. Similar concerns about exposure to misinformation were also highlighted by parents and carers in their survey. Conclusion: our research highlights the growing role of generative AI in children's daily lives and in the classroom. Generative AI is increasingly embedded in children's digital experiences, though its use remains largely guided by traditional search engines such as Google. Our survey explored the varying impacts of generative AI on children by asking, how do children feel about generative AI? How do parents and carers whose children use generative AI perceive their use? What concerns do they have? Our findings reveal that many children express optimism about AI's role in education and creative play. However, their enthusiasm is notably higher among those whose parents have a positive view of AI, suggesting that parental attitudes may shape children's confidence and engagement with these tools, raising questions about the role of informed guidance in AI interactions. At the same time, uncertainty around AI, concerns about misinformation, and variations in engagement highlight the need for responsible AI integration. The RITEC framework, which considers dimensions of children's well-being such as creativity, autonomy, relationships, competence, and safety and security, provides a useful lens for interpreting our findings. Generative AI appears to foster creativity amongst children, with strong engagement in creative activities such as writing stories and generating fun pictures, particularly among 10-year-olds, 56% of whom use it for creating fun pictures and 51% for writing stories. Autonomy is reflected in children's varied use of generative AI for learning and communicating with their peers, though access disparities, e.g. between private and state school children, may impact equitable autonomy and inclusion. The increased use of generative AI for communication and companionship by children with additional learning needs aligns with the relationships dimensions by fostering social connections. The use of generative AI for schoolwork, particularly among male children, relates to competence, promoting educational support and building confidence. However, autonomy and safety concerns are evident when considering that 37% of children with additional learning needs use generative AI for chatting and keeping me company, highlighting the need to ensure safe and supportive digital interactions. For teachers, we investigated generative AI adoption by exploring regional differences in uptake, the differences between private and state school teachers, subject-specific variations in AI use, and the key determinants or deterrents of AI adoption. Our findings show that while teachers recognize AI's potential to enhance learning, particularly in lesson planning and personalized education, concerns persist around reliability, critical thinking, and academic integrity. Some teachers are already integrating AI into their work, yet they highlight a lack of clear policies and training, emphasizing the need for structured guidance to help them navigate these tools effectively and responsibly. Further questions remain, such as whether differences in AI used between private and state school teachers are due to disparities in institutional support or resource availability. Additionally, could AI be providing much-needed support for teachers working with students who have additional learning needs? As generative AI continues to evolve, it is crucial to address these gaps in understanding and practice. Training and policies, informed by the RITEC framework, are essential for equipping both educators and students to engage with AI safely, responsibly, and effectively educated. References: Bastani, H. Bastani, O. Sungu, A. Gu, H. Kabaksi, O. Mariman, R. 2025. Generative AI Can Harm Learning. The Wharton School Research Paper. Bright, J. Enoch, F. Esnashari, S. Francis, J. Hashem, Y. Morgan, D. 2025. Generative AI is already widespread in the public sector. Evidence from a survey of UK public sector professionals. Digital Government, Research and Practice. Association for Computing Machinery. Common Sense Media. 2024a. The Dawn of the AI Era. Teens, Parents, and the Adoption of Generative AI at Home and School. Common Sense Media. 2024b. Teen and Young Adult Perspectives on Generative AI. Patterns of Use, Excitements, and Concerns. Kasoi E. Jong, S. Sinha, A. Gopnik, A. and Kraljic, T. 2024. Children's Mental Models of Generative Visual and Text-Based AI Models. National Literacy Trust. 2024a. Children, Young People and Teachers' Use of Generative AI to Support Literacy in 2024. National Literacy Trust. 2024b. Using Generative AI to Support Literacy in 2024. What do we know? National Literacy Trust. Nugnatsarioli, M. and Laurenti, O. M. 2024. The Future of Child Development in the AI Era. Cross-disciplinary perspectives between AI and child development experts. United Nations General Assembly. 1989. Convention on the Rights of the Child. United Nations. Williams, R. Park, H. W. and Brazil, C. 2019. A is for Artificial Intelligence. The Impact of Artificial Intelligence Activities on Young Children's Perceptions of Robots. In Proceedings of the 2019 CHI Conference on Human Factors in Computing Systems, pages 1 to 11. Association for Computing Machinery.